Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today we'll be reacting to another general knowledge video, unknown colonial empire. So what is a colonial empire? First off, you're going to firstly think of places like the United States, which is a very recent colonial empire. More things come to mind, like Europe, specifically like Great Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany. These empires that took place in the scramble for Africa, the East Indies, the Dutch. But what will this video cover? I'm very curious. I will let you know if I did know of these places, but you let me know as well. Let's jump into it.
Main colonial empires. If you like history, then you probably know the main colonial empires that existed during the times of European colonialism: Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy. But there were other smaller European nations that attempted, sometimes with a certain degree of success, to establish their own smaller colonial empires.
Norway as well.
And even some examples of non-European nations which at some point briefly had a type of colonial empire.
Hold on, I don't like this map already. Why is Ethiopia colored? I thought Ethiopia was never colonized. Let me know if I'm messed up right there. I thought or colonized or controlled by Europe. I thought Ethiopia was spared.
So in this video, I'm going to talk about a few of the lesser known colonial empires in history. First, Denmark. Denmark is probably the most
Greenland.
well known out of these lesser known colonial empires. It held territory, although few and small, in every continent with the exception of Oceania. If we count their European possessions, which were technically also overseas domains, they actually controlled a lot of territory.
I'm trying to figure out the years here too, because is this like Viking Age? Because that makes sense.
Norway, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, effectively controlling the northernmost part of the Atlantic Ocean. Although this wasn't that rich of a trading route, so it didn't mean an incredible gain for them at the time. They also temporarily ruled part of Estonia and a few lands in Courland. In America, Greenland became theirs, their largest territory, and still under their rule today, although that might soon change with local independence. And while these icy domains weren't very profitable, they still served some purpose of expanding their control and acquiring specific Arctic goods like furs and pelts, as well as fishing. On top of those, they also expanded into the typical colonial areas. In the Caribbean, they established the Danish West Indies, controlling several islands such as St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, which they bought from the French. In 1917, the opposite happened, and these islands were sold to the United States, today known as the US Virgin Islands. In Africa, they held a few forts and trading posts throughout the coast, which they also eventually sold to the British. They also tried their luck in India and engaged in trading with China. Their colonies were Tranquebar, Serampore, and the Nicobar Islands, which they called New Denmark.
That's really cool. I didn't know about that. I mean, it's not cool in terms of colonialism, but it's interesting.
At the highest peak of their Asian colonialism, they sold an incredible amount of tea to the British for gigantic profit. However, during the Napoleonic Wars, the British attacked and destroyed the Danish naval forces, effectively forcing the Danes to sell them their Indian territories. Also in Northern Europe, Courland, or Courland, I'm not sure how to...
And we got back up just to add some context here. Because Bernadotte, who's of the Swedish throne, the Army of the North, eventually, of course, invades Denmark, and I think this coincides with the British naval superiority, which was just timing. Great Britain had a monopoly on naval superiority and colonial trade across the world, sea to sea. The sun never set on the British Empire until the 1950s, really. So. Yeah, this was truly an interesting land grab.
Indian territories. Also in Northern Europe, Courland, or Courland, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, like Brandenburg and other German states prior to unification.
Wait, did we go to a new, like, are we on a, No, it's those shows at the chapters down there were on Danish. Okay.
Seldom their Indian territories. Also in Northern Europe, Courland, or Courland, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Like Brandenburg and other German states prior to unification, Courland had some early attempts at colonization.
The chapters are just not right. Okay, so this is like during the HRE?
Was a Polish-Lithuanian fief, which decided to venture out into the oceans. Their colonies were established under Jakob, Duke of Courland, and were, due to Courland's status, indirect colonies of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as well. And at this time, between 1642 and 1682, Jakob's reign, they had one of the largest merchant fleets in all of Europe. They made voyages to the West Indies, where settlers established the first colony in Tobago.
Trinidad and Tobago.
The first attempt at the colony was apparently a failure, but it was refounded and seemed to go well the second time around. This was in 1639.
Wait, is that that Barbados? Or is it Trinidad and Tobago? I can't remember. On the map, it looks like the first option.
While later, in 1651, the Dutch gained a colony in Africa on St. Andrew's Island.
Oh, that's the Gambia.
In the Gambia River. They also gained control of additional land, including St. Mary Island, modern-day Banjul, and Fort Gillifrey, but they only held control of these lands for less than a decade before ceding them to England in 1664. The cedence happened because Courland was weakened during the Northern Wars against Sweden. In America, the Tobago colony also failed, mostly, I think, due to native resistance. Another very much unknown colonial effort, mostly because
the Knights of Malta, which is a crazy story of the Crusaders, and it's so fun to watch them go from Crusades to Malta, then getting crushed by the British, and then moving back to Rome in a palace.
It was made by a fairly unknown and now mostly gone country, that of the Knights of Malta. These are the successors, if you will, of the Knights Hospitaller, which at one point ruled over the island of Malta as a vassal state of Sicily. Today their territory is only a building inside of Rome, but for a while they were a country of decent strength. Their rule over Malta and small parts of North Africa, mostly only around Tripoli, took place from...
I didn't know Tripoli was part of... That's interesting. I wonder if that's just like their trade port with the Ottoman Empire.
1530 to 1798. And in this interval of time, they also ventured onto the Caribbean.
That's something I didn't expect. What? So these guys were mercantilists.
And established colonies. The Hospitaller colonization of the Americas occurred during a 14-year period, from 1651 to 1665. At its peak, they possessed 4 Caribbean islands: St. Christopher, St. Martin, St. Barthélemy, and St. Croix. These were purchased from the French Compagnie des Îles de l'Amérique, which had just been dissolved. However, their rule didn't last very long, and 14 years later, they resold them to the new, rebranded French West India Company. Still in Southern Europe, we have Ragusa. Ragusa was at the time a Croatian city-state.
Ragusa, yeah, it's a city-state. If you've ever played Civilization, you know that. Interesting.
In Southern Europe, we have Ragusa. Ragusa was at the time a Croatian city-state, located on the Adriatic coast. Unknown to many, it sort of had a colony in India. Ragusans were famous merchants and navigators, and their mercantile republic, as the name implies, relied heavily on trade. At one point in history, they had one of the largest trading fleets in Europe.
So this is like the Eastern Venice.
And embassies in many European cities to be able to facilitate trade with these countries. Probably wanting to expand their trade with other continents, in the 16th century, they had an attempted colony in India. It was within Goa, a Portuguese domain in the region, so Ragusan sovereignty was never a thing as far as I know. But they established a trading outpost in the São Brás colony, with many native Ragusans moving to the area. They built this church, replicating one in their home city and dedicating it to Dubrovnik's patron saint, Saint Blaise. It apparently went reasonably well at first, but then, for whatever reason, trade between them and the Indians began to slow down, and many settlers moved away from the colony. In 1667, Dubrovnik suffered a tremendous earthquake, which destroyed much of the city and ended its prosperous trading business.
These earthquakes really hurt a lot of people.
Their financial and military power became much smaller, even in Europe, and so any colonial ambitions and projects were fully abandoned. A major country at the time that could never really establish a strong colonial presence was Austria/the Habsburg Empire. However, they tried. Austria briefly tried to colonize the Nicobar Islands in the East Indian Sea, but just like the Danish tried and failed, so did the Austrians.
Well, I know they could easily take it over from the natives. I'm just wondering what colonial power prevented this. I'm going to say either the Dutch or the British.
After the Danish left, the Austrians took over the island chain and stayed there from 1778 to 1783. Eventually, the colony was abandoned because of the death of Gottfried Stahl, who was in charge of the territory. Austrian interest in overseas domains declined even more, and eventually they just sold it to the British, who took them over. There was also technically a trading company through their territory in Flanders, and this was the Ostend East India Company, a private merchant company formed in 1715. But no Austrians were involved in it, and the only connection to Austria was the fact that Emperor Charles VI controlled their lands. Later in 1778, Empress Maria Theresa was intrigued in Asian colonialism and decided to form the Austrian Asiatic Company of Trieste. They tried establishing a gold mine settlement in the Mozambique coast, but it failed and they were
Well, that's not really Isaic, is it?
soon expelled by the Portuguese. At one point, they tried buying off Rio de Oro from Spain in the West African coast. Despite the support of the Austrians and the emperor himself, the Hungarians blocked the purchase on the
Hungarians blocked the wow.
basis that naval expansion would damage the national budget. They also had a small concession zone in Tianjin in China, but only of 0.6 square kilometers, which they lost during World War I. The Habsburg Empire, then Austria-Hungary, was probably the only one of the big European powers at the time to not establish colonies. I guess Russia is probably another example, only reaching out to Alaska and a few outposts in California, amongst others.
I mean, just looking at this map, I would say Russia, Russia doesn't have a lot of warm water ports for the most part, but on this map they definitely do. I mean, Russia has so much territory already. Think about all these like smaller cities, states, and like the Dutch, English. Their countries are very small, so they're a lot of the times the whole point of colonization is either spreading religion, spreading for resources, or taxing people. Russia, I mean, it wasn't always Russia before. It was a multitude of things. But Russia, look at Russia's territory. They don't have to go get new land. They don't have to. It's quite different.
The reason why these two great nations didn't venture out to the oceans that much is simple. They ventured out by land. Austria-Hungary's empire took over the territory of other natural nations, if you will, like Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, and so they were already expanding their rule over these new lands. They were also extremely problematic lands, and so they kept them busy enough so that they wouldn't, or most likely couldn't, venture out anywhere else. They had enough problems in Europe as it was. Russia also expanded by land, but differently. They ruled over some problematic places too, but also mostly other uninhabited places, like Siberia, a gigantic territory whose Russian colonization and annexation some compare to the temporary rule that the British had over India. I'm not sure I agree, but it was definitely important.
Sweden. What did Sweden have? I don't even know. We're about to learn.
Further north, Sweden. Like Denmark, Sweden also had a few significant colonies in Africa, America, and Asia. In Africa, they held the Swedish Gold Coast, or Cape Coast, in present-day Ghana, with a few settlements: Fort Apollonia, Christianborg, Battenstein, Wietzen, and Karlsburg. They arrived in 1650, but eventually lost these to the Danish and the Dutch by 1663. In America, they established colonies in New Sweden, St. Barthélemy, and Guadeloupe. New Sweden was actually in continental North America, a Swedish colony along the lower reaches of the Delaware River.
That's interesting. Wilmington? That's interesting. I never knew this. And I'm American. So a little bit of New Jersey, PA, and Denmark. Oh, that was Denmark. Delaware. Wow, Fort Christina. That's cool.
Continental North America, a Swedish colony along the lower reaches of the Delaware River from 1638 to 1655.
Wow.
Fort Christina in Wilmington in Delaware was the first settlement, and they soon expanded to what is now New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania.
So the Netherlands were under the Swedish Empire at the time? Because I knew obviously about Fort Orange, New Amsterdam, and all that. But I didn't know that was an entity of the Swedish Empire.
New Sweden was conquered by the Dutch Republic in 1655 during the Second Northern War and incorporated into the Dutch colony of New Netherlands. St. Barthélemy was an island in the Caribbean which they sold to the French, ruling it for less than a year only. In Guadeloupe, they gained after Britain ceded it to them, but it ended up going to the French as well, who had originally colonized the island. In Asia, in 1733, the Swedish East India Company established a factory in Porto Novo, now Paringuepetai, although after a month it was destroyed by the British and the French, and it really seems that the major European powers played an important role in stopping these other small ones from ever achieving their level of power in colonialism. And still in Scandinavia, Norway, it seems the first colonial experience.
Norway. Okay, now this is the Norse people, right?
Experience of Norway was different than most countries. They didn't have colonies of their own, and not even a trading company.
Never mind.
As far as I know, they simply controlled the company Société do Madal in Portuguese Mozambique, which owned coconut plantations and a palm oil factory. Their only real territorial expansion, which I guess we could call colonialism, happened much later.
Was there anyone they were colonizing though? These. I know the Peter Isle down there had nobody. Boutenwinkel might have someone. A lot of these places look so desolate.
The 20th century, Norway occupied Eric the Red's land on Greenland from 1931 to 1933. Their expeditions of Antarctica led to Norway's annexation of Bouvet Island in 1927 and Peter I Island in 1929. Their later expansion into the open seas kind of led to their full-on annexation of these islands until today, not losing them in the decolonization process, as was the case for most of Europe's overseas territories. Although these were uninhabited when they were claimed, and so it makes sense that they
Is it colonized when you're not colonizing anyone?
Would remain theirs. Norway also maintained sovereignty of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. Plus, despite it not being state-led initiatives and therefore never making them Norwegian territories, many settlements throughout the world were established by Norwegian people. Examples include the Norwegian colony in California, Marburg in South Africa, Joinville in Brazil, and Norsewood in New Zealand. And finally, the only non-European nation on this list, New Zealand.
New Zealand? Alright, what we got?
This is a really debatable choice because New Zealand didn't really have a colonial movement, but they sort of experienced an example of colonialism. Between 1920 and 1962, they controlled Western Samoa, which they took off the Germans that had controlled it since 1900. After World War I, the League of Nations attributed a mandate to New Zealand to rule over the islands. From what I read about this, it seems that they didn't really want them, and the Samoans didn't really want them there either, and both sides were happy when the experience ended. In 2002, the New Zealand government even issued a formal apology to Samoans for their rule on the island in colonial manner, which serves as a good opportunity to remind us once again that despite the historical interest of colonial empires, we must always remember that they were built off the effort and exploration of natives, in the majority of cases forcing people to work only for the colonizers' profit and submitting them to a foreign power just because it happened to be stronger. So those were some of the lesser known colonial empires that have existed, from tiny attempts that were ultimately a failure to other ones which were indeed somewhat successful but just happened to not be very well known because they are so much smaller than the empires of other major European powers. These were the main ones I could find, and other than New Zealand, they are mostly confined to Europe, and even New Zealand kind of has a European dimension considering its role as a British domain at the time. So if you know of
unless you count the Maui people,
any other short-lived or just territorially small
Maori people.
Colonial empires in history, just let me know in the comments and I can make another video on this.
All right, cool. This was interesting. First off, leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment. Next, this was interesting. I think we learned a little bit, specifically Courland. Didn't know that was a thing. That was interesting. The Danish side made sense. The Habsburg Austrian colonial empire. Really didn't know that about that. That's really cool. Ragusa, they kind of held their own for a little bit. Sweden, that was surprised. New Zealand, that was a fun fact with Western Samoa. The Knights of Malta, didn't know they owned Tripoli. That's cool. And the Norwegian colony, was that really even colonization? I don't think so. I think y'all just found some uninhabited rocks and stuck a flag there. Just my opinion, though. Yeah, that's all, guys. Have a good day. Peace out. Bye-bye.